Well, this morning we've reached our halfway point, approximately, in our journey through 1 John together, and exploring actually 10 questions that are embedded in this letter that help it make it clear to us who is for real and who isn't for real, who is bogus when it comes to genuinely following Christ. So if you haven't already, get your outline out of your bulletin there. We'll help you fill in the blanks. And then take your Bible and turn to 1 John, the 3rd chapter this morning. Would you pray with me? Father, the words that you have shared in your word in this particular passage are life-changing, and we just pray that you would open our hearts to receive. I pray that every word, everything that's shared would be toward the end, that we would be more in tune with you and walking in your will, that you'd be glorified through it. You only would be seen and heard. It's in Jesus that I pray. Amen. Today's test question is really a second love question. First love question, going back to the 2nd chapter, the 10th verse, it said, whoever loves his brother lives in the light, and there is nothing in him to make him stumble. And the question that we explored at that point was, am I loving others as Jesus loved? Now this morning we're going to look at verses 11 through 24 of the 3rd chapter. And in that particular section of 1 John, basically the idea that I've received from him is he's asking the question, how's your love life anyway? And he's not talking about your relationship to the opposite sex. So what is love anyway? Just look at the screens for a minute, and we've got some opinions from people on the street about it. And then we'll go on from there.
What is love?
Love can be a lot of things.
Love, I don't know, that's a difficult question to put it in the least way.
Sir, what is love?
Love is many things to many different people.
What do you think love is?
Love? Well, that I really couldn't tell you what love is. It's just, to me, it's just a couple of people that they connect with each other. They feel good with each other. That's what I think love is.
Love is a definition of just something spiritual.
What is love?
Ooh, I don't know. I got burned so many times, I really don't know anymore, to tell you the truth.
There's no true answer to it. Everyone has a different definition of what love is.
What is your definition of love?
Sincerity and just being with the person I happen to be with for 33 years.
What is love?
Love is having a respect and a care and a concern for yourself and your fellow man. It doesn't mean necessarily you have to go around putting your arms all around everybody and giving everybody big hugs.
You can't really explain love. Love comes from inside of you. It's not. Love is being faithful, truthful, honest, you know.
Do you think there's different degrees of love?
Sure, and don't ask me what they are.
Do you think there's different kinds of love?
Not really. I think it's just one kind of love. Well, yeah, I guess you could say love for monetary things or selfish things versus personal love for human beings, you know.
It all depends. I never really thought about that. Yes, there's a lot of different loves. There's love like you share with your kids. There's love where you share with your, like your parents or something like that. It's different love. Or your friends, that's different love.
Do you think there's different degrees or different kinds of love?
Yeah. Like, emotional stuff or, like, sentimental stuff. It's 2 different things.
The Greeks mentioned about 3 or 4 different ones. They talked about eros, which is erotic love, phileo, which is brotherly love, which we get the name Philadelphia from, city of brotherly love. There's agape love, which is unconditional love. That's the type of love God has for mankind.
Have you ever been in love?
Yes, many years ago, when I first got married. That was, 50 years ago or so.
Wow.
And since then, it's just, like I said earlier, it's just an attraction with me, and now that I'm remarried, when we got married, I didn't get married the second time for love. It was just somebody that I felt good with, that was all. Now, after time, I love my wife, yes.
What do you love?
I love Christ, I love my family. I have good self-esteem, so I have a love for myself.
What do you love?
I just love being alive.
Well, there was at least one guy in that crowd that kind of had a handle on things. So, how would you define love? Okay. And the question came up, are there different kinds of love? You know, our English language really doesn't really help us out with that very well, because we say, I love baseball, I love chocolate, I love my dog, I love my wife, I love my husband, I love to walk on the beach. Use the same word to describe just a myriad of shades of all kinds of things the concepts of love. Now, the Greek language, which was referred to in the video there, was a lot more specific than that. And of course, you know the New Testament was written in that language. And there are actually 4 words in first century version of Greek for love. And actually 3 of them that are used in the New Testament. The 4th one is not. The one that's not used in the New Testament is the word eros. And we get the word erotic from it. And it has to do with sensual attraction. It has to do with romantic type love. The Lord has made us, every one of us, and has equipped us with qualities of eros. It's part of how we're created. And it's intended that be consummated in a relationship of marriage. Sex appeal was created by God. Be news to a lot of people, it wasn't created by man. And it's really overemphasized and overrated in our culture in a lot of different ways. Too many relationships around us are primarily based on eros type love alone. The second Greek word for love is probably the most familiar to a lot of people, and it's the word philos. And of course, we get the term Philadelphia from it, which means the city of brotherly love. I'm not sure that Philadelphia, Pennsylvania really is a brotherly love city, but anyway, that's what it means. Philos has to do with companionship. So we're talking about friendship, we're talking about partnership. It's like, I like hanging with you. I like being around you. I like spending time with you. I like sharing life with you. It's that bond of friendship, of companionship. How many of you have a close friend? Not everybody does. If you have a close friend, have had that experience in your life, then you've experienced philos type love. Then there's a third word, that's the word storge. And storge is it's the love for family. The love that I would have for my sister. I have one older sister. The love that I have for my kids. It's a natural, protective, affection type of love. The love I would have for my parents, or the love that they would have for me. How many of you have brothers and sisters that you're close to? Here again, not everybody has that. Well, if you do, then you are fortunate to be able to experience storge love. Interestingly enough, all those types of love are based on getting something. Eros is easy because it's based on the fact that I receive physical pleasure from it. Storge, we've all seen family relationships broken. Someone maybe that's crossed the lines too many times in our family, and maybe we're just done with them. But Storge, if you've been in a situation where you've defended any of your family, you would understand that. Philos, even the bonds of friendship and partnership can fade in life over the course of time. Maybe somebody betrays you. Maybe somebody makes a mistake. Maybe they stab you in the back. I don't know if you've ever been stabbed in the back. I have a few times. And when that happens, the Philos love just disappears. Now, there's a fourth type of love that we know, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the word agape. I've mentioned it many times. It's a love that says, I'm committed to you always to do what is in your best interest. That's a good, simple phrase to always remember about agape love. I'm committed to you to always do what is in your best interest. So it's totally unselfish. It's never dependent on anybody loving you back. It's the action of treating you right, regardless of how you would treat me. I mean, you can treat me like dirt if you want to, and I'm still going to do right by you. So, how many of you have embraced the love that Jesus demonstrated on the cross and have allowed him to lead your life? If that's the case, then you have experienced agape love in that sense. Now, John writes here in verse 11 of chapter 3, he says, this is the message you've heard from the beginning, that we should agape love one another. So, the love that John is talking about here is not a duty, but it's actually a proof. It is a sign of something. Remember that loving one another is the mark of a true Christian. The test question here that all of us need to answer this morning is this: do my life actions express love for God's family? Do my life actions express love for God's family? To answer that question, John talks about agape love in a very interesting way in this passage. First of all, he gives us a portrait of the devil's children, and then he gives us a portrait of God's children. And by exploring that, we're confronted with a tremendous picture of what Christian love is, and whether or not we are really living that or whether we're expressing that in our lives. So number one on the outline there, you see the portrait of the devil's children. Verses 12 through 17 is where that portrait is found. How many of you knew or know that the devil has children? Yes. Well, the truth is, the devil has more children than God. Everybody is either in God's family or the devil's family. There isn't any in between. There isn't any outside. Let's look at the devil's children as it relates to love. And there are three things given in picture here in this passage. Verse 12, we have murder. It says, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. Why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. So we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel here when it comes to human relationships. You can't get much worse than killing someone. And Cain, of course, would be the classic example of a murderer. If you go back to Genesis, the 4th chapter, verse 1 says, Adam lay with his wife Eve. She conceived and she gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. So he chose to worship the Lord with the fruit of his labor. It seemed a good thing for him. Verse 4, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he didn't look with favor. So, have you ever thought about what in the world is up with that? Why was God so partial to Abel anyway? Well, what's implied here, and it's not directly, in the words of the text, but what's implied here is that God had already given them some instructions. Because Abel brought firstborn. It's one indication. And they were to bring a blood sacrifice to seek forgiveness in worship. You see, the penalty of sin is death, and so there has to be a death in order to atone for the sin. So, Abel obeyed, but Cain brought first fruits of the soil. Stuff that he had planted himself, that he had harvested himself. He was offering God, he was coming before God and worshiping God the way he wanted to do it. He was doing it on his terms. He was approaching God his own way. And God just squashed that in no uncertain terms. You see, the path to God is always through obedience, always. And it's not through what we think is best. I don't think any of us probably experienced that, right? Verse 5 says, Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. He was ticked off. He was scowling. Unhappy camper. Verse 6, then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face down? Why are you scowling, man? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. In other words, if you don't want sin crouching at the door of your life, then just all you have to do is go back and do what is right. That's all you have to do, Cain. It'll be okay. But he didn't want to do it God's way. He didn't want the way of grace and obedience. He wanted to depend on his own human effort. Has sin ever approached you that way? I think probably all of us probably can relate to that. Verse 8 says, now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. So, why would he stoop so low? Go back with me now to verse 12 of our text in 1 John 3. It says, because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. That describes one word that starts with a great big J. Got any idea what it is? Jealousy. Verse 12 says Cain belonged to the evil one. You see, he was of Satan's family, Satan himself. He was a child of Satan. That was the evidence of it. The evidence was he was a murderer. You belong to your father the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. That's what Jesus said to the Jewish leaders of his day in John the 8th chapter. In contrast, the children of God agape or love their brothers. They don't murder their brothers. It's also interesting that the term murder that's used here refers to butchering by cutting the throat. The term referred to here has to have a context of slaying animals for worship purposes, which was instruction that God evidently had given. So evidently, you see, the only way that Cain knew that something died was what God had told them to do, to sacrifice animals. You see, at this point, nobody had ever died. Nobody had ever physically died. So he did to his brother what he had learned from God to do to animals when they were given in sacrifice. He cut his throat. Think about it. God established a pattern of sacrifice for sin to bring men to himself. But the first offspring of man perverted that and turned it into murder. How interesting. The human race learned to murder when it was taught to worship. You talk about twisted. Jealousy was at the base of Cain's murder. And that's what life is like, you see, with the devil's children. They murder. Don't have to look very far in the world that we live in today, of course, to verify that truthfulness, do we? Let's go a little bit further here. The next part of the portrait, second part, is hate. Verse 13, do not be surprised, my brothers, if the world hates you. In other words, since the world hates you, don't be surprised. No, not a surprise. In other words, Cain was a prototype of the world system under the control of Satan. He showed the ugly qualities that Satan generates in the life of everyone who is of the devil's children. They are hateful, basically. What is it that we've seen on the streets of Seattle and Portland, and even some in Olympia over the summer, and even continuing today? What do we see? Hate. It's not that everyone in the world is incapable of forms of love and good deeds, but you see, generally speaking, the world is characterized by murder and by hate. So it goes without saying that the wicked system of the world will continue. It's going to hate believers. We're going to see more of that. Verse 14 goes on to say, we know that we have passed from death to life. Let me ask you, have you ever doubted your salvation? Come on. Okay. Well, here's the litmus test right here in this verse. We know that we have passed from death to life because we what? We love our brothers. Literally, we have a continuous and habitual love for our brothers or sisters, other Christians, in other words. On a scale of 1 to 10, if you were to make a scale of 1 to 10, where are you on that one? Do you really agape the people of God's family? Do you love the fellowship of the other Christians? Do you seek the fellowship of other Christians? Is it a high desire in your life? Is it a priority in your life? Verse 15, anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. If I love, I'm alive. If I don't, I'm dead spiritually. See, the literal term for murderer here in verse 15 is manslayer. And of course, it's not meant in a literal sense, but it is really meant in a moral sense. Hatred, morally, you see, in the eyes of God, is exactly the same as murder. The only difference between hate and murder is the act. The attitude is the same. And if you're going to hate someone, God sees that as murder. No murderer, verse 15 says, has eternal life in him. The point is, in the general pattern of life, a true follower of Christ loves, and an unbeliever hates. If you go to Matthew, the 5th chapter, just for a minute, the Sermon on the Mount, verse 21, Jesus says, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, referring to, of course, one of the 10 commandments. Verse 22, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother without cause will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother Raka, which means fool or idiot, is answerable to the Sanhedrin, which was the council of the 70 that ruled Israel. So anyone who says, you fool, in other words, cursing someone, will be in danger of the fire of hell. So the way I treat my brother, you see, in terms of attitude, according to Jesus, is just as important as the action. This is where Jesus went beyond, you see, what the law presented. Because in God's eyes, you see, the attitude is equal to the act. Now, everybody murders, not everybody murders, and not everybody hates. But it is characteristic of those who are dead spiritually, Satan's kids. And then the third part of the portrait is given in verses 16 and 17. It says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. Interesting correlation. Love is not defined here in any way as an attitude or as an emotion at all, but it's totally defined as self-sacrifice. Agape is the epitome of self-sacrifice. In God's family, as Jesus laid down his life, we ought to lay down our lives, he says. Now, not many of us, get the opportunity to physically give our lives for other Christians. It just doesn't, we haven't experienced that. But verse 17, it kind of just lays the cookies you see down on the shelf where all of us can relate to this, where all of us can lay down our lives for others. Look at what it says. If anyone has material possessions, I ask you, is there anybody here this morning that has material possessions? Okay. I guess he's talking to us. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need and has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? So you see, if I claim to belong to Christ and there's a need right in front of me, and I know that I am capable of filling that need, and I turn my back on the situation, that's indifference. The world system that we live in is characterized by indifference, apathy, unconcern for anybody outside of its own system. And for that matter, with a lot of people, it's for anybody even within their own system. Case in point that I've had in my file for a while. The Detroit News reported on January 28th, 2009, 12 years ago, a news story. Quote, it says, this city has not always been a gentle place, but a series of events over the past few frigid days causes one to wonder how cold the collective heart has grown. It starts with a phone call made by a man who said that his friend found a dead body in the elevator shaft of an abandoned building on the city's west side. He's encased in ice except for his legs, which are sticking up like popsicle sticks. You can see that on the screen behind me. The caller phoned to tell this reporter, why didn't your friend call the police? Well, he was trespassing and he didn't want to get in trouble, the caller replied. As it happens, the caller's friend is an urban explorer who gets these thrills out of rummaging through and making photographs of the ruins of Detroit. It turns out that this explorer last week was playing hockey with a group of other explorers on the frozen waters that had collected in the basement of this building. None of the men called the police, the explorer said. In fact, they continued their hockey game. The epitome of indifference. That's the world that we live in. It isn't just what Christians don't do that marks them. They don't murder, they don't hate habitually, but it's always what they do that marks them. The care of each other, the sacrificial love that's evident in contrast to where the world is. This is part of what attracted the society of the first century to the church in Jerusalem. We must have a willingness to surrender possessions, comforts, and everything that has value in our lives. I'm willing to give it to you if you have a genuine need. Take note, this says, he who sees his brother. So this is especially to be given to those who are members, you see, of God's family. This is not saying that we should run all over Lacey throwing money at people indiscriminately. You know, we could pacify ourselves doing that kind of stuff, because when you do that kind of stuff, either literally or figuratively, you don't really get close to anybody when you do that. But the idea here is that within the community of believing people, we are to meet each other's needs. Listen carefully. You and I are in debt to whoever needs what we have. That's a biggie. Think about it closely. I'm in debt to whoever really needs what I have. And if I don't live that kind of life, then my salvation, you see, is going to be in question. Two things make me responsible for other Christians. First of all, if they have a genuine need, and secondly, if I've got what they need, and that's really all that matters. The big picture here is that the children of God will make supreme sacrifices for each other. So once again, John is saying that we must learn to love as Jesus loved, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. We are to bend over and wash feet, if you please. We are to be willing to give our lives, even. We are to be willing to give a man what he needs that we have. It doesn't make any difference what the price is, even if it's a high risk for me. Christians share. Christians share. That's a part of what the Christian life is all about. And like I said, that was what was characteristic of the church in Jerusalem and why it exploded in growth. The world couldn't understand that and just flocked to it. So much of the portrait of the devil's children, it's kind of a bleak picture of what we talked about so far. Verse 18 begins to introduce the portrait of God's kids, okay? Verse 18 says, this second part of your outline there. Verse 18 says, "Dear children," so here's the characteristic. "Let us not love with words or tongue, but with what? But with actions and in truth." So our love is to be in action, not primarily in word. Flapping your jaw isn't going to get it done. Actions are essential. If we're following Jesus, we will love differently than the world loves. Let me just illustrate that within the context of marriage. If someone were to come to me and say, "Dwight, do you love your wife?" "Oh, yeah." "Well, how do you know?" "Well, on June 13th, 1987, I stood before all the people, and I said, 'I do.' And she said her vows. I said my vows. She said she does. Pronouncement was done. I'm so glad that I only had to commit my love once to her. Only once did I say, 'Yes, I'm committed to you.' Now it's done." And people can come up and ask, "Hey, how's your relationship to your wife going?" "Well, on July 13th, 1987, I did that." Well, are you loving your wife? July 13th, 1987, I did that, duh. And if Carol ever comes up to me and says, honey, I need you to love me more, I say, whoa, wait a minute. Wait just a minute. July 13th, 1987, I did the vow. In fact, we've got pictures. There's proof. It was done on that day in the Arizona mountains, Happy Jack, Arizona. There it is, I promise you. The skinny guy on the picture there, that's me. Been just a little bit of a change, yeah. So, hey, man, there you go. That's all you need. That's all the proof that you need. July 13th, 1987. We even have an audio recording of it. Don't ever ask me again. Doesn't matter. I made the commitment. How many of you know I'm being just a little silly? July 13th, 1987 didn't end anything. It just started a whole new journey. It's been quite a journey. We get that, you see, when it comes to our relationships with other people, our spouses or whatever. Why is it so hard for us to understand that when it comes down to what God has asked of us? Once we respond to Christ's death on the cross and we submit to him as the Lord of our life, we're then, you see, committed to a daily action of love. Now, verse 18 says, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. The contrast there to words is action, and the contrast to tongue is the idea of hypocrisy. So don't let your love be all talk and no action, and don't let your love be hypocritical, but love in deeds. Let it be action and let it be in honesty. Don't love just emotionally. Don't love just with an attitude, but love with your life is the idea. Agape love is deeds of self-sacrifice, and it has to be that way for the true follower of Christ because he has given us his love and he loves through us. Now, there are some blessings that are mentioned here about agape love this way. The first blessing that's mentioned here is assurance. Look at verse 19. It says, this then is how we know that we belong to the truth, and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence whenever our hearts condemn us. How do we know? By loving with actions and in truth. Verse 18. Love, you see, is the final objective test for our Christian walk. When you can point to deeds of self-sacrifice in your life, and you can say, hey, doubts, get out of here. Insincerity, get out of here. Just look what God has done through the power of his Holy Spirit, showing love in my life. The world doesn't do stuff like that. The fruit of love, you see, is assurance. The word rest here, interesting word, it's the word pathos, or patho, excuse me. And it means to tranquilize. When your heart gets all upset, you can tranquilize your heart by reminding it of the actions of love that you see evident in your life. So when my conscience starts pounding and probing, hey, Adelman, are you for real? Look at this over here. Look at this over here. Look at this over here. Look at that. Look at the stuff that's been done. It's then time to remind myself of what God is doing in my life that demonstrates his sacrificial love. And that, you see, what that does, it tranquilizes gives rest to my heart. Verse 20 goes on to say, for God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. And I would add, and he doesn't condemn us. That to me is just mind-blowing. It's so fantastic. But God doesn't really know me like I really know me. Oh? God is greater than our heart and knows what? Everything. And he still doesn't condemn me. When my conscience starts condemning me, where do I go for security? Do I say, on August 10th, I went forward at a church, I confessed Christ, or I was baptized, or whatever? No. It says, it's conscience. I have shown in the pattern of my life a love for the people of God. It's evident in my life. It's evident in my lifestyle. I know that I belong to the Lord because only your kids love unselfishly, and that's a pattern of my life. And God, who is greater than my heart, confirms that fact, and I stand uncondemned. So the first benefit here is assurance. And then there's a second blessing, and the second blessing is answered prayer. Verse 21, dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God and receive from him anything we ask, because we obey his commands and do what pleases him. So if my heart doesn't condemn me, I have confidence, you see, before God, that when what I receive from him, I will receive from him anything that I ask. You talk about tremendous promise. We're talking about answered prayer. Anybody here want to have your prayers answered? There are 3 conditions given here. Condition number 1, verse 21, no harboring of sin. If my heart doesn't condemn me. You see, Psalm 66:18 says, if I have cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would what? The Lord would not listen. So harboring sin and not dealing with it in my life puts a barrier, a big fat barrier between me and the Lord. And he won't listen. That's a biggie. Verse 21 implies no condemnation in my heart. So my sin has, you see, been dealt with. That's an initial hurdle that must, you see, it has to be in place if our prayers are going to be answered. Second condition, verse 22. We receive from him anything that we ask because what? We obey his what? His commands. Obeying his word is a prerequisite for answered prayer. And quickly, a third condition in verse 22, because we obey his commands and do what pleases him. So if you really want answered prayer, well, there it is. No harboring of sin, number 1. Number 2, obey his word. Number 3, always seek to please him. The bottom line is that habitual behavior of the true follower of Christ is agape love. It is translated in obedience, doing what pleases him, answered prayer. That's a mind-blowing promise right there. Then one last benefit in verse 23 and 24, and this is his command to believe in the name of the Son of God, or the Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as he commanded us. Those who obey his commands live, or in other words, abide in him and he in them. And this is how we know that he lives in us. We know it by the Spirit that he gave us. Did you notice that verse 22 refers to obeying his commands, plural? But here he reduces it to a single command that has 3 parts. And this is his command, to believe, or in other words, to trust, to love one another, and to obey his commands. Everything in the Christian life is summed up there in those three parts. And you cannot separate those three parts at all. The child of God believes, trusts, loves, and obeys. And what's the beautiful result? We live, or we abide or dwell in him, and he does the same in us. And we know it by the Spirit that he gave us. The third great benefit when we love is Jesus loved. When we allow him then to love through us. God's kids are characterized by agape love, and the evidence of that love in my life brings assurance, number one, brings answered prayer, number two, and also the knowledge that the Lord abides in me. So the test question, do my love actions express love for God's family? When I look at the evidence of my life, what does it say? Mom was used to hearing cartoons on Saturday morning, but the amount of drawers opening and closing and dressers slamming, she realized that something was going on. By the time that she walked into the room, her second grader already had all kinds of paper on the table, a little glue and markers and scissors and paint. She asked him, "What's going on?" He says, "Mom, it's close to Valentine's Day, and I'm making a list of every kid in my class. And I want to make every kid, I want every kid to have a card. You have a huge class, son." Also knowing in her heart that for the last 2 years, he got excited, and he came home with no Valentines himself. It's a cruel world. And she's confident that one day he'll find his niche, but now he doesn't fit in with the rest of the kids. Not accepted. So she loves him the way any mom can and should. "Why don't you make just a couple of cards for a couple of kids?" "No, Mom, I want to make one for everybody." And as much as she tried to talk him out of it, the whole weekend was filled with cutting and pasting and marking and painting and putting names on it. And coming into the kitchen and saying, Mom, I almost forgot that kid that sits in the back." And another card had to be made. This goes on through the beginning of the week until the night before Valentine's Day. And he says, "Mom, I want to get a great big bag. I've got all kinds of leftover paper, and it could be for my cards." She tried to talk him into maybe a small little box with a slit on top of it so nobody could really see that it might be empty. "No, Mom, I want a big bag." She watched him take the big bag full of all the cards that he had made off to school. And that day, she bakes, and she's ready for the inevitable. The bus pulls up after school, and all the kids get out and they start walking, and once again, he starts walking about 30 feet behind all of them. Always hearing the laughter and the conversation, but never being invited into the conversation. As he gets closer, she sees the big bag rolled up in a tight little bundle under his arm. And his hands are empty. And her heart breaks. As he gets closer, she walks out to the front porch. She sees his head down, and she can hear him muttering, "Not one, not a single one." And with that, she rushes down She stoops down to hug him, and he buries his head in her apron. And he says, and she said, "How was your day, son?" And he looks up, and his eyes are beaming. And the smile is huge on his face. And he says, "Not one, ma'am, not one, Mom. I didn't forget one single one." That second grader had begun to understand the concept